Welcome back in. I'm Collette Wieland alongside Dr. Stevphen Camarata. Steve is the author of Late Talking Children, A Symptom or a Stage. This book right here is now in its second edition. And we're going to keep talking about something in the book about early childhood services. I want to continue that conversation. You write in the book that many school districts have a limited number of what you referred to as prepackaged programs, that they essentially steer a child into a certain IEP, right? So we should probably reestablish what an IEP is again, and then what's the problem with steering them into a prepackaged program within that?
So an IEP is, I stands for individualized, E, education, and P, program. It's important to remember the I part. The I in IEP is individualized. But and the IEP is actually a contract between the school and the parents for the services their child will receive. It includes eligibility, placement, and goals. And so the reality, though, is that schools have limited resources, and so they're often going to have prepackaged programs that are set up for certain types of challenges, learning challenges that people have. And so what often can happen is that the school will have in mind, I've got this special classroom for people with autism, for example, children who are eligible under autism, and I'm going to put kind of everybody in there, regardless of their skill level. And so that's not really how it's supposed to work, but we can understand that schools are organizing themselves around programs. What makes the difference, though, and what matters to parents is that they really want to make sure that their child is getting in the right classroom, the right placement, and that they have the right goals for their child. And it's really not the parent's problem to actually figure out what program their child should be in. It's really the school's responsibility to provide those individualized services. And it can be a mix. It can be part in the regular classroom, part in a special classroom. My late talking son was in a regular classroom, but then he also had some what we call pull-out services for reading. So he had reading tutoring that the school provided. And so it's really important that the parents look at where the school is recommending their child be placed and see if it's really a good match for their late talker's learning style.
If their child is being put into one of these prepackaged programs, what advice do you have for parents and how to navigate that?
So it's really important that up front that if they see that it's not a good match for their child, that they just refuse to accept that placement and just say, you know what, that we appreciate your advice, but this isn't really a good match for our child. And again, there can be a lot of pressure that comes. I've been in meetings where there's 5, 6, 7 school people there with different types of expertise, and the parent can feel kind of overwhelmed, and there may be a lot of pressure for the parents to accept the recommendation of the school. If it's a good match, great, accept it. But if it's not a good match, don't sign the IEP. If there's a lot of pressure and you're uncomfortable at the meeting, it's also fine to say, you know what, I'd like to stop the meeting. We'll come back another time and talk about this more. So just don't feel like you have to accept what the school is offering unless it is a good match for your late talking child.
Well, that's what I wanted to ask you is, do you have to accept the path that the school district has chosen for your child? Obviously, you just said, no, you don't. No. But the pressure those parents must feel, right? What can you do to help them get through that?
Yeah, no, and that really is hard. And so really the best thing or the best advice I can give is to get a copy of the IEP ahead of time. Don't just have it come to you at the last minute. If you get something and you don't agree with it, postpone the meeting. Don't go into the meeting until you kind of know what the agenda is and what's going to happen. And don't feel pressured into accepting a label or a placement or goals that aren't really what your child needs. But parents have rights in this, and it's important that they stand on their rights when it's necessary. But I have to tell you, it can be really difficult. In some ways, I'm happy being a late talker because when I'm in these meetings and people are making recommendations, it doesn't make me really overly nervous if I'm really convinced that the placement isn't correct. But I certainly see in parents the stress, the worry. I mean, you always think, what if they're right? What if I'm not seeing my child in the right way? And so sometimes it can go that way. And that's why it's also good to have a partner, an advocate go into the meeting with you who really knows the system and can give you good advice.
So parents can ask for that?
Parents can get advocates. Parents can have outside people participate. All these things are on the table. So, and they may not necessarily know that. There's also a package of rights, a list of rights that parents are entitled to. Get that ahead of time, review it so you know what your rights are. Sometimes I've been in meetings where they don't present the rights until the actual meeting when they're asking the parents to sign off on a plan that the parents don't agree with, and they haven't really had time to review their rights.
So you're in the middle of a meeting trying to go over maybe an IEP that was just handed to you plus your rights, and you kind of
yeah,
a little bit overwhelming.
It is overwhelming. And again, I want to stress that most of the personnel, the school people, clinicians are really good. They have the child's best interest. I'm talking about things that can go wrong a little bit, but at least give it a chance. Give the process a chance because it might work out really good. I don't want to hear this as all. I don't want people to hear this as all negative. But there are times when it goes wrong, and the parents does have rights to get the services and the placements for their child that the child really needs.
I understand what you're saying, but we want to prepare those parents for worst case scenario a lot of times. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
So if a child's given a developmental delay label, what questions should a parent ask once that happens?
So any kind of label, but especially developmental delay because it's such a non-specific, amorphous kind of a label. You just want to say, well, what is it that you're seeing in my child? When you say they're developmentally delayed, does that mean you think they can't learn as quickly? Do you think that they're intellectually disabled? How do you see my child, and what does this mean for placement? So developmentally delayed is, often we recommend someone take that label if there's a general delay in development. But you just want to be sure you understand what the school is thinking and how they see your child and how they see their future. The other thing you always want to ask is, if I take this label and I take this placement, does that mean that they'll never have a different label? Does it mean that they're never going to be in with the regular children in a regular classroom? Because sometimes an early label can then persist even when the child's changed completely in terms of their learning style or what it is. And so you also want to kind of get the school's kind of philosophy on what developmental delay means. And that's true for any other label they would get, autism or intellectual disability, whatever it is. You want to know what it is that the school means when they're saying that.
In your experience, what's the difference between a general delay or intellectual delay?
So a general delay is where, in toddlers and preschoolers, we just don't have a good way of precisely identifying their intellectual ability. When there's a very noticeable impairment, or there's clearly, like some of the children with Down syndrome will have intellectual disability, and we'll see that early on. But a lot of times we're not quite sure, and so it's better to say, okay, they're delayed in their language, and they may be delayed in their pre-academics or whatever it is that aren't necessarily related to talking. We're going to look at that, and we're going to treat them. We're going to work with them. We're going to educate them, and that's going to inform then our decision going forward. So the developmental delay is a good label if it's used properly. And then intellectual disability means that in addition to late talking and being behind in talking, basically almost every skill, many of the skills that the children have will take more time to learn. So it shouldn't be viewed as a limitation or a prescription for failure. It should be, this child's going to need additional support to learn any subject on into the foreseeable future. Whereas the developmental delay means we see these areas of weakness. We don't really know whether it's going to be an intellectual disability down the line. A lot of times it's not. But, it's just really hard to measure intelligence in a toddler or a preschooler. In fact, really, I'll just say that studies show that you really can't get an accurate IQ until the child's really in middle school, or late elementary school, till they're 10, 11 years old. That's when IQ becomes really stable. Prior to that, it's kind of like the third that are going to take a little more time and need extra support, kind of the middle third, and the third that are actually learning more quickly. That's about as precise as it can be. And then there's a large literature to show that.
Instead of specifics, more
right.
generalities.
No, like someone says your IQ is 110 versus 105. That's not really a meaningful difference. And so you want to be aware of that, and that's really why we want to be a little careful in the preschoolers and toddlers. Oftentimes they won't answer, and is it I can't or I won't? Sure. And until you know that, I'm always really happy when they answer incorrectly, and I know that they're giving me their best answer. I mean, I'm always happy when they answer correctly. Obviously, that's the best. But if they don't answer, I don't know. Is it because they don't know, or they just don't want to comply with the testing? So you want to be cautious about that as a clinician or somebody who's assessing a child.
Are children eligible for services with just a late talker label or a speech language label?
So there's not an official late talker label. Late talking can be a stage or a symptom. It can mean a lot of different things. So that's not a label that would qualify someone for services, because it could be a stage where you don't need any extra support other than parent education and things like that. So speech and language delay absolutely is one of the eligibility categories that you can get services from, and it's just as valid and as well understood as autism or other labels. So you might say, oh, we know more about autism. No, not really. Each of these categories has information that we know about, and we know interventions that'll support it. We know teaching styles. So there's a lot of information on it. So you don't necessarily have to have an autism label in order to get services. In fact, most late talkers for whom the late talking is a symptom, it's going to be speech and language disorder. That's way more common than autism, and way more common intellectual disability.
Can you get more access to services if you have a severe label? And so is there any benefit for pushing for a more severe label?
So there's really not. The IEP process and the law, the individual, the idea, education for individuals' disabilities, that legislation says that whatever their eligibility is, they need the services in order to learn. Now, it's not that you have to have every single service under the sun. The school doesn't have to do that, but they do have to provide services and the level of support the team recommends. And so someone might say, well, you get more services from autism than you do for speech and language. That doesn't have to be true. It really depends on what the support team recommends. Now, it is true that certain programs, like if a child's intellectually disabled or if they have autism, they might have higher needs, and there's programs to support that. But again, the label itself isn't really what generates this placement in services. It's really what the team says that child needs.
When you're sitting down for an IEP meeting, you've been present for some of these, right?
Many, yeah, all over the country. Yes, indeed.
What kind of things have you seen go wrong?
So I think probably the thing that goes wrong the most is where the school may have an inappropriate eligibility and then a program that's tied with that. So what I really care about is, where is the child being taught and what are the services that they get? That's what's really important. What's the child's experience? And so, as I said earlier, there can be this team that's there that really pressures a parent to take a placement and an approach or an educational set of services that don't really match their child's needs. And so that's probably that's the thing I worry about the most. And then again, the other thing is that it's certainly possible that a child needs to be in a classroom that's not the regular classroom, a special classroom. But we also know that if they're in that special classroom, for them to get back into the regular classroom later on is very low probability. And so I don't want to do that unless it's really clear that's what the child needs in order to learn on into the future. We had one case where I was in an IEP meeting. They were really pushing the parent to be in a segregated classroom. This child actually was actually above average in her learning skill. And, I did ask a question. They said, oh, we're just going to take the placement now. And then, a few years we'll reevaluate and see if they can get in the regular classroom. And then I just said, well, in your district right now, how many people were in this special classroom and then ended up in the regular classroom? There was silence. And then finally the director of special education said, well, actually none. And so the child was in that. If the child was put into that placement, then they weren't ever going to be reintegrated in the regular classroom, and there weren't really steps to do that, even though the school may have said it. So that's really what I worry about. And then sometimes too, the people on the ground doing the work, the teachers, special education teachers, they may have the programs, they may not realize those are alternatives. And so it's also important to do your research before going into the meeting and see what the different options are. That can be a little hard to do, but parents can do that and get a list. I've had situations where I'll say, oh, why don't we have this placement? And then people that are in the local school say, well, we can't offer that. And then I'll look at the director of special ed and I'll say, oh, is it the policy of your district that that's not available? And they're like, well, actually, because it's legal. Another little point is that it's important to kind of record the meeting. So you come in and you say, okay, we're going to record, because that helps people be accountable. Plus, you can refresh your memory if there's things in the meeting that happen. So anyway, mostly it's going to go well. Sometimes it doesn't. So you need to be prepared for that.
Sure. I know. I don't want to bring doom and gloom to people
Yeah,
going
we have
into
a lot
these,
of great examples, including my own late talking son. He had wonderful teachers, wonderful services. There were some recommendations we didn't take, and thank goodness we were prepared to do that. On the positive side of it, we just couldn't be happier with the people who cared about him, supported him, and it was just a great experience. So that can absolutely happen.
I think it's interesting you said to record it. What are parents' rights if a school district's like, I mean, is it everyone's right to record that meeting, or is it state by state, county by county?
Yeah, so parents can make a legal record. Now, some states say, well, you might have to pay someone to transcribe the session, but it's a legal proceeding,
Okay.
So they absolutely can, have a record of it. And I recommend that. I mean, again, it seems adversarial, and people might get a little nervous about that, but it's just better all the way around if you have a record of it and and then also people then are a little more cautious about making sure that all the procedures are followed and all the rights are protected when there's a record of it. So I see that as a benefit, and I don't see it as a downside.
Okay. Has a parent ever stopped a meeting, and do they have that ability if they're not comfortable or don't understand
Absolutely.
exactly what's happening?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
no, I really recommend that. And so if there's if the school is really digging in and they're not listening to the parents, and or the parents are just feeling really pressured, it's absolutely fine to say, you know what, we need to stop this meeting and we'll come back. Let's reschedule, and we've had more time and I can review the options and so on. Absolutely, I really recommend that. That's far better than getting in place a placement and goals that really just don't fit their child and could actually end up kind of derailing their learning. And on the one hand, you're making decisions, in the short term for a year, but really these things have long-term implications for a late talker's development. So you want to spend the time and get it right.
What point should a parent go ahead and say, yes, I accept this, and sign the IEP?
So that should happen when they agree on the placement, if the child's in the regular classroom, or if they think that their child really is going to really be a better match in one of the separate classrooms. And then when the goals are explained and actually align with their child's needs. And so when they're happy with it, and again, the can be a very positive thing. Again, I recommend that the parents get a draft IEP before the meeting so they can review it, so there's not any surprises that come up in the meeting. But when they're happy with it and they feel that their child's going to do well and flourish in that school, by all means, sign. Absolutely.
Can a parent's agenda for their child differ from the agenda of a school? Specifically talking about a parent is looking for a diagnosis, right? And a school might be looking for placement. So kind of break that down for us,
so
please.
That can be a challenge because schools are simply making the children eligible for services. They're not really doing diagnosis. So that can be a little confusing. So a child might be eligible, for example, under autism services, but a medical person evaluating the child might say they don't have autism, and that can be confusing. And that matters because an autism classroom may be dealing with traits that their child doesn't express. So that actually happens not uncommonly because of this misalignment. And again, that's why it's important to have a good eligibility and an accurate eligibility, but it's especially important to have the placement and the goals be really correct for the child. And what can happen is, and again, so many of our special education people are working as hard as they can, and they're overwhelmed, speech paths and so on. They may have like a generic set of goals that are provided that may not match their child because it's basically there's eligibility for speech and language impaired. Then there may be some goals that are generated that they just kind of apply to everybody. And again, I understand that's efficient, but we at least want to modify those so they fit the child's individual needs.
So the parent should not be afraid to work with
parents actually are allowed to and encourage, again, under IDA, the Education Act for people with disabilities. They're actually encouraged and they're supposed to be a part of the team. Having said that, I do encounter situations where parents are demanding extra services or things that the school doesn't necessarily have to provide. So parents might read about a particular kind of intervention or some kind of a computer program, and in that situation, the demand that they're making to the school isn't really reasonable, because the school has to provide, kind of the basic support services, but they're not obligated to provide services above and beyond that. And certainly, sometimes parents will come in and they may have read something, or they might have heard from a friend that X program was beneficial for that other child. Schools aren't necessarily required to provide that. So that's important to know as well, that parents need to be realistic and understand really what the school's role is and how much they're required to provide. It's not carte blanche, So, and there are, non-evidence-based treatments that schools absolutely shouldn't be giving that parents may believe are going to be helpful. And so that can be a challenge too. And I do see that happen too sometimes.
If a school gives a child a label and it's not 100% accurate, what can a parent do at that point?
So with regard to eligibility, the schools have a lot of latitude in how they design the criteria for being in a certain eligibility, and it's really hard to knock out an eligibility because there is a lot of latitude. There are times when it just doesn't fit at all, and people can say, no, that just doesn't match my child. But there is a lot of latitude, and the states make up criteria, so it is hard to knock something out. That's why I really focus on placement and goals, because the schools are not saying they're diagnosing the child. They're just saying they're eligible for services under these labels. Sure. And so if that's a problem, there's a more detailed way of thinking about it, and we can talk more about that in a separate session. But the idea is really it's hard to change an eligibility.
If you get a label and it's not the right label, there can be a long-lasting stigma attached to that child, right?
Yeah, actually, it really becomes kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. One of my favorite studies was done decades ago, and basically they took children who were kind of typical, in the broad range of typical in their learning speed and learning ability, and this is not meant to be critical of teachers. It's just how people are, and so they randomly assigned they took the children and divided them into thirds, and they told this teacher, these kids are smarter than average. Another teacher, they said to the second group, these children are about average. And then the next teacher, they said, these children learn more slowly. And then after, a short term, it became a self-fulfilling expectation. They were all the same, but the ones that they told the teacher were smarter than average actually learned more. The ones that were average learned average, and the ones they said weren't as quick learning didn't learn as much. And so, again, I don't want any teacher to hear that and say I'm criticizing teachers. Correct. It's just normal. So if you say to somebody, oh, this person has autism or this person has an intellectual disability, then it might change their expectations. So one of the things, for example, in Down syndrome is children with Down syndrome they have language ability that's often quite a bit lower than their actual learning ability in other areas. Their overall learning ability is not quite the same rate as other children, but they actually are more likely to learn. It could be some math things, it could be puzzles and so on, because their language ability, speech and language ability, is uniquely affected by the Down syndrome for lots of reasons. But anyway, the point is that people see that and then they say, oh, they can't learn to read or do math or other things in the same way they're not learning how to talk, and that's just not true, and so they become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So we really want to be careful about our assumptions.
How can parents get those labels out of there if they're the wrong label, though?
Yeah,
what steps do they need to take?
Right. So again, if the eligibility is just blatantly inaccurate, like the case I mentioned with the attorney, we were able to get rid of that eligibility because it wasn't really sustainable even based on the school's criteria. And so if it's really clear, just a clear misidentification, then you could knock it out. But it's not easy to do. And what you have to do actually is bring evidence. And that's often what it takes, is some evidence. The other part of it is often our late talkers are really good with visual, spatial, math, analytical things, and so we can do achievement testing or pre-academic testing that shows that they're actually stronger in those areas. And that actually has a lot of benefit because it reassures the teachers that the child can learn. Remember, I think about, teachers know they're good. They know that the child's not learning in the same way as other kids, and then they might think, oh, this child has generally slow learning. But if you come in and they're like a little advanced in problem solving and nonverbal types of things, then it'll reassure the teacher that it's not something more general, and then that can help them engage their teaching.
What about a child with more than one label? And that means they could be eligible for services in more than one category. How do parents navigate that?
So that can happen. So it could be that For example, there's a generic category called other health impaired. So maybe the child has some kind of an illness or some kind of a condition that allows them to have other health impaired, and they may qualify, say, for speech and language. And so parents can kind of look at that and see what the different services that are offered and how in a sense, how the IEP team presents the information to them and then decide which way to go.
Is it kind of like looking which one is higher priority and prioritizing one or the other?
Yeah, I mean, again, when there's multiple eligibilities, really what you're looking at is which one best matches my child's needs. And then also, how does the school kind of react to it? And I actually like using other health impaired because it really requires individual support services because it's not a specific, there's lots of different health conditions that relate to it. And so, that gives me as an advocate a lot of opportunities to work with the schools on the I and IEP, which is individualizing it, which is a real benefit. But, again, the key here is you really want, if you have multiple eligibility options, pick the one that best matches your child. In the long term, that's always the best option.
Thanks, Steve. This is all great information. In our next podcast, we'll explore the law versus the practice when it comes to special education services. We hope you'll join us here next week for that. In the meantime, please feel free to ask us a question. Just drop it in the comments section below. Click subscribe so you don't miss a thing and hit the bell. And you can always check out the Late Talkers Foundation website.
And always remember, the best thing for your child is you.